Episode 278, COP26, What's Changed? This is the Change Underground. I'm your host, John Moore. Decarbonise the air, recarbonise the soil. So they've reached a consensus in Glasgow. From the UN press release, quote, adaptation, mitigation and finance are all strengthened in a complex and delicate balance supported by all parties. After 6 years of strenuous negotiations, pending items that prevented the full implementation of the POress Agreement on carbon markets and transparency have finally been approved. End quote. Apparently, though, coal isn't going to be phased out but phased down, whatever the hell that means. Then there's this from Politico.eu. Quote, Glasgow climate talks finished Saturday with a familiar outcome. The collective march towards action to tackle global warming is gaining momentum, but still falls short of what's needed to avert a crisis. End quote. And those last 9 words, fall short of what's needed to avert a crisis. This talkfest is getting well beyond a joke. We know what has to be done, we know how to do it, we just won't. The entire tobacco industry-inspired fossil fuel defence of coal, oil and gas, and their less than subtle attack on science has worked. Should we just pull the blanket over our heads and stay in bed? No. Now's the time to demand, in the liberal democracies of the world anyway, that politicians put into action what is required. The media hasn't, as a general thing, helped. I listened to the BBC's newscast reports on the COP. I must say I was bitterly disappointed. What was once a thoughtful, sober reporting corporation descended into the horrors of a vegan croissant being mislabelled for its carbon footprint. And the whole of the podcast was not too far above that level of inquiry. Meanwhile, the realities of climate change are biting harder than ever. Here in Australia, with memories of the black summer of 2019-2020 still fresh, areas of central, that is desert, and eastern Australia have received more than the average November rainfall in the first week of November. And the chemical farming paradigm is also starting to face the reality they have ignored or hoped wouldn't happen. From the ABC, longish quote. Quote, with global prices soaring, it seems odd timing this week for Incitec Pivot to announce plans to close one of Australia's largest fertiliser plants. The rising cost of another commodity, natural gas, appears to have sealed the fate for Incitec's Gibson Island facility in Brisbane. Despite extensive efforts, we have been unable to secure an economically viable long-term gas supply, the company said in a statement to the Australian Stock Exchange. The decision to close Gibson Island manufacturing facility after more than 50 years of operation is expected to impact about 170 employees. The company said it would cease manufacturing with natural gas at the end of 2022, but was looking into the potential of green ammonia. End quote. Before we unpack that little story, from the Royal Society, quote, ammonia is a pungent gas that is widely used to make agricultural fertilisers. Green ammonia production is where the process of making ammonia is 100% renewable and carbon-free. However, the process for making ammonia is currently not a green one. It is most commonly made from methane, water and air using steam methane reforming to produce the hydrogen and the Haber process to make the nitrogen. Approximately 90% of the carbon dioxide produced is from the SMR process, that is turning the methane into steam. This process consumes a lot of electricity and produces about 1.8% of global carbon dioxide emissions. End quote. 1.8% of global emissions before the stuff has even hit the paddock. So now we know what green ammonia is, or in fact isn't. The point is, fertiliser production is coming under pressure. Cost pressures, also known as price signals, are pushing players out of the market. What happens when all the carbon-intensive inputs in agriculture become unprofitable to produce? If only there was some other way to maintain soil fertility. And yes, I'm being facetious. Well, this has happened before to a country, not just the whole world, which we seem to be facing. And it happened recently and on a smaller scale, but not for the people involved, obviously. Cuba. Following the collapse of the Soviet Union, Cuba's free-ish supply of ag chemicals and diesel from the USSR was turned off almost overnight. That would have been about 1991. In an article from 2008, The Guardian's Ed Ewing reports, quote, "When the USSR collapsed in 1990-91, Cuba's ability to feed itself collapsed with it. Within a year, the country had lost 80% of its trade," explains the Cuba Organic Support Group, COSG. Over 1.3 million tonnes of chemical fertilisers a year were lost. Fuel for transporting produce from the fields to the towns dried up. Integrated pest management, crop rotation, composting and soil conservation were implemented, says the COSG. The country had to become an expert in techniques like worm composting and biopesticides. Worms and worm farm technology is now Cuban export, says Dr. Stephen Wilkinson, Assistant Director of the International Institute for the Study of Cuba, end quote. Since 2008, developed regenerative systems would allow much of the agriculture to survive, nay thrive, if there was no choice. Things got pretty bad in Cuba. Average daily caloric intake dropped from around 2,500 a day to between 1,500 and 1,000. And no one wants to see that happen across the whole globe. We have plenty of warning with this one factory closing, and if we accept it as a sign to change systems, then we can be in place long before we run out of artificial nitrogen. The Cubans were caught as flat-footed as the rest of the planet when it came to the last days of the Soviets. We have some warning. The benefit of changing over now, apart from the obvious health ones, is of course the climate. Getting animals out of CAFOs and onto pastures benefits both. Soil rebuilding using atmospheric carbon through photosynthesis and animal digestive tracts would also start the process of cleaning waterways and removing the fertiliser load. There are so many upsides to the end of the chemical fertiliser industry, but it will terrify many. It will mean change, and change is difficult at times. And if COP26 showed us anything, it showed us that change needs to happen more quickly than the pledges to change add up to. We can almost assume the actual changes will be less than the pledges unless we can grab this time by the scruff of the neck and then gently and with compassion bring the world with us. Accepting change is difficult for most of us, especially when we have no control over it. By seizing the moment, we can make the change we need to take control back. There will still be weather events like the 16 centimetre, that's just over 6 inches, hailstones that hit parts of Queensland last week. There will still be floodings and hurricanes and wildfires, but by seizing the moment and starting the changes now, those things will ameliorate over time. From being deeply depressed by the whole climate thing some 6 months ago, I have come to the conclusion that we can, as a species, get this sorted and get it sorted quickly. So keep growing as much of your own food as possible. This removes transport and production emissions from at least some of our food systems, and if done regeneratively, actually builds soil by decarbonising the air and recarbonising the soil. And if you're ready to make that leap, there's a free ebook over at the website. Just click on the tab. And the course, of course. That's starting to sound like Mr. Ed. And the course is available over at the website as well. Thank you all for listening, and I'll be back next week.